Hi, it's Pastor Andy with our Wednesday video this week. And many people are familiar with Jesus' statement that he made on the last night that he was with his disciples. And a part of that statement, you can find a lot of this in John 14, 15, 16, and then the prayer in 17. But part of this is the picture that Jesus paints, this imagery that he shares of the vine and the branches. And you can find that in John chapter 15, the beginning of John 15. Paul uses something similar. He talks about the tree and the branches in Romans chapter 11. And there are similarities, but they are not quite the same. In Romans 11, the branches of those who are not faithful are cut off. In John 15, on the other hand, Jesus' statement is that the branches that are faithful are pruned. There is nothing that suggests that there could be new branches brought in Jesus' use of the vine and branches. But here in Romans 11, Paul says that there are branches that are not a part of the original tree that are grafted into the tree. So again, there's some parallels here, but they are not directly related. But one of the similarities that we do have between them is the idea of nourishment. Jesus says, if you remain in me. That's talking in one sense about nourishment. Paul actually uses the word nourishment in verse 17 very specifically. So the idea of that nourishment is important, but the source of the root that provides that nourishment is not nearly as clear. Some commentators, in part probably because of John 15, equate Jesus to that root. And of course we can go back in the Old Testament and talks about Jesus being the root as well. But given the context of Romans, I believe it's more likely that Paul means the forefathers of Israel. That of course, Jesus is the true nourishment. I'm not denying that. But Paul has already discussed the faith of Abraham in Romans chapter 4. And faith is the key element of this current section of the letter that Paul is writing. So the Jews did not have faith. So as branches, the Jews being the branches from that original core, that trunk, so to speak, if you think of a tree trunk, of the faith of the forefathers, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the branches, being Israel, not having faith, broke off, and the Gentiles were grafted in. Those that did have faith were grafted into that core faith that was established, faith in God that was established in a very covenantal type of way, at least, beginning in Genesis chapter 12 with Abraham. So I believe that the forefathers being the root is the most logical approach. But beyond that, many people get caught up in this example of Paul using a tree. Okay, that's fine. Because the olive tree is very plentiful in Israel. It's very plentiful within the Mediterranean region for that matter. But the difference in the trees here, people get caught up on that. The way Paul makes this analogy happen would show that Paul doesn't know anything about horticulture. Now, first off, let's understand that the natural branches of the olive tree, well, they were of a cultivated tree. These cultivated olive trees are throughout the Mediterranean region, as I just said. They are cared for, and they are meant to help ultimately to produce olives, which produces olive oil, etc., etc. But there is another type of uncultivated tree, a wild olive tree, and those branches can be grafted in to a tree that is healthy. At least one would think that is true. That is the metaphor that Paul is using. But that's not the way it actually worked. The normal process was to take the branch of a good tree, a cultivated tree, take the branch off, and then graft that into a wild tree. Not taking the branch from the wild to the good tree, but the branch of the good tree to the wild tree, and using some mixture of clay and maybe some straw and then some cloth to bind things together. Eventually, oftentimes, that good branch would end up nourishing the rest of the tree to make it a fruitful tree, because wild olive trees are not good for bearing fruit. But that is not what Paul was saying. He was taking the opposite approach. He was saying, take the branch from the wild tree and graft that one in to the good tree. This process was not usual, and generally speaking would be considered detrimental to an otherwise healthy tree. Therefore, people, probably certainly in Paul's day, but even people today, say Paul doesn't know what he's talking about. It's like Paul is from an urban area and he's trying to plant a garden and do something that he has no idea can't be done. But here's what Paul knew that you and I need to understand from this passage. God knows how to do it, right? Paul wasn't saying this was possible necessarily from human terms, but with God all things are possible. And if God wants to take a branch from an otherwise unproductive tree and put it into a good tree, well, that branch can become productive as well. Paul knew, as one commentator said, Paul knew that God is not bound by the limits of what people see as natural. So Paul is quite intentional in using this metaphor, actually not only in using this metaphor of the tree and branches, but in how he used this metaphor of tree and branches. And his point here was not that the root was sustained by the branch, but that the branch is always sustained by the root. In other words, it is a lack of faith that would cause a branch to be broken off of an otherwise faithful tree. The Jews had been removed from this tree, this metaphorical tree, because of their lack of faith, but the Gentiles had been grafted in because of the faith that God had given them, the grace that He had given to them, and their belief by faith to receive what God had given. So in speaking to the Gentile in this section as he is, Paul is warning the Gentile not to be arrogant. First off, as I mentioned in Sunday's in Sunday's message, don't be so arrogant as to say that, well, I'm better than you because I'm here and you're not. God has now chosen us and He's rejected you. That's one measure of arrogance. But another measure of arrogance here would be to say, I'm now a part of this tree. I can't fall away from the tree. And what Paul is saying is wait a minute. That's exactly what happened to the Jews when they quit exercising faith and started trusting in themselves. So Paul is making that same argument now back to the Gentile. And he goes on to say that if a natural branch has been broken off of a tree, meaning a branch that was originally from that tree is broken off, if it's possible for God to take a branch from another tree and to graft it in, how much more easy, how much more natural is it to take a branch that was already broken off of the tree and put it back onto that same tree? Paul makes it very clear in verse 24 that he realizes this natural and unnatural understanding of this perspective. He's not trying to say something is not possible, and he's not trying to use an example that would not be possible to say, look, I know better. He's saying God can do this because God knows better. And it is because of God's grace that any of the grafting can happen in the first place. So, it may not be easy for a person to graft a wild olive tree into a natural olive tree. It might be impossible for a person to reattach a natural branch back onto the same tree. But if God can bring a person back from the dead, which is that measure of faith back from Romans chapter 10, 9 and 10, just a few paragraphs ago, then it would be easy for God to replace, to restore a branch that was already a part of the tree. Therefore, we need to remember that God makes all of this possible. It's not what we have done. It's not that we are the tree. It's not that we have been grafted into the tree, at least not of our own. It's something that God has done. And so we should be thankful to Him and to find others that might need to be grafted into that tree as well, and to help them know God so that God can restore or graft them in for the first time, whatever might be needed.